Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Terry Belcourt. I'm the Director of Practice here at the SRNA. My role today is to help facilitate this excellent webinar. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that this presentation is being held on Aboriginal land and recognize the strength, resilience, and capacity of the Treaty 4 and Métis people of this land. Today, our topic is reconciliation, talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what it is, and honoring the calls to action. We have Carol Reese here. She's a nursing advisor here at the SRNA, and we're excited to have her here presenting a little bit more about the TRC and what the SRNA is doing as we take action on the calls to action. But before we get started, I'd like to note a couple of things for you. So as a participant in this webinar, you're able to send in chats and comments through the chat. So you'll find that in a little bubble either at the top or the bottom of your screen. So you can add in your questions throughout the presentation. Carol will, I think, take them at the end. Yes. Yeah, questions at the end. So you can put your questions in the chat or in the question and answer module, either one of those, and we'll monitor those and bring them forward towards the end of the presentation. We are recording the webinar, so you can take a look at it again in the future by going to the SRNA website and accessing the link, or sharing it with your friends and colleagues for them to have a look at. We'll also be sending out an evaluation of the presentation, and that will come to you through your email tomorrow. So now that we've got those housekeeping items out of the way, I'll turn the microphone over to Carol.
Hey, thank you, Terry. I'm very happy to be here, and hopefully we'll make a little bit clear what the SRNA is doing to honor the calls to action. So first of all, hang on, sorry.
Just click over on your
screen. Click.
Sorry. Okay, so today's objectives are to identify what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is, provide you with some more information on that. We're going to talk about the history of the residential schools, which was one of the triggering factors in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're going to talk about the calls to action as they specifically relate to health, but they do apply to several areas in society. And then what the SRNA is doing to live the calls to action. So what is the TRC? The TRC was established in June of 2008, and it was established to document the history and the impact of residential school system and the lasting impact on Aboriginal peoples. In 2015, the report was released to the public, and it is now being widely accepted and acknowledged by several organizations, several groups of society. So the residential schools were a mechanism by the government to put about a cultural genocide, erase the language, traditions, and histories of the Aboriginal peoples. Many of the lasting impacts are intergenerational family dysfunction. Many Aboriginal people are ashamed of their heritage through what they learned in the residential schools. There's anger towards the schools and the parents, fear of authority, self-destructive behaviors such as alcohol and drug abuse, suicidal behaviors, family violence, ineffective parenting, unresolved grief, and a loss of collective support, being that families are disconnected. All right, so the residential schools were initially not part of the treaties. The government decided, following the signature of the treaties, that they wanted to create these schools with the impact being that they erase the Aboriginal culture. So children were taken from their homes by authorities such as the RCMP, parish priests, and Indian agents. They were taken to a foreign environment where their belongings were taken from them. They were given clothes provided by the school. There are stories of some children that came with coats and stuff that their parents had made for them, beaded for them, and those were taken away and burned, and they were never to see them again. Many of them lived in a world that was dominated by fear, and loneliness and lacking of affection. Siblings were parted. Older boys were not allowed to communicate or be housed with the younger boys, and the same as it was with the girls. They were not allowed to talk to their siblings, and they could be severely punished if they were caught sneaking away to speak to a sibling. So it'd be a pretty scary time there, all by yourself, essentially, and not being able to communicate with anybody. So the residential schools were often run by Christian missionaries whose object was to spread the word of God to the heathens and savages, were the words that were used within the report. They were taught that only good people were white Christian people. The missionaries are going to build up their good character to counteract any of the evil tendencies of the Indian nation. The educators often lacked formal education and were poorly paid. They were sometimes missionaries, nuns. Sometimes they had people that came through the church but didn't have any educational background. Students were often punished for speaking their own language. They only spoke their own language on arrival, mostly. They were taught English, and they could only speak or interact in English. Sometimes they spoke their own languages in secret with other students or their siblings, but would be punished if they were caught. This involved things such as their hands being slapped, their being slapped in the mouth, wash their mouth out with soap. Some reported that their hair was shaved off of their head. So it was cruel, the types of punishments that were heaped on these kids. The government saw that the continued use of Aboriginal languages by the students was a failure, so they really strived to make sure that they spoke English. Students were often subjected to physical, sexual, emotional, and mental abuse at the hands of the staff. Discipline was harsh. Corporal punishment, along with public humiliation, was the main way of disciplining students. They were beaten by staff. They were given bread and water diets. Some reported being locked in closets or basements or crawl spaces as a punishment. And there was also complaints of sexual abuse by both boys and girls that were largely ignored by the authorities and not investigated, often dismissed by the officials. Students were to learn to read, write in English, and learn the skills they needed to become self-sufficient. So they were to learn things like farming, raising cattle, mechanical trades, so that they could become a part of the general community. And the government hoped, in becoming a part of the general community, that students wouldn't return to their home communities and would give up their status as Indians. Their education was mainly memory work. It wasn't a lot of critical thinking. It was just reciting things that were said to them. Their education had no relationship to their home or to their culture. Students were discouraged and even threatened by school officials that they would be punished for participating in traditional ceremonies related to their culture. And the traditional ceremonies were often viewed by school officials as outdated superstitions or devil worship. Excuse me. The education they received demeaned Aboriginal history. It ignored the current situation of the Aboriginal students and their families as citizens. Textbooks perpetuated the stereotypes of savages, and students couldn't identify with the content being taught because that was not their lived experience. Okay, the residential schools experienced chronic underfunding. The funding was always lower than comparable institutions within the US and other parts of Canada for the white students. It was essentially institutionalized child labor. Students were required to raise, grow, and prepare the foods that they ate, make and repair clothing, and maintain the schools. Chores were to be done before school and after school, and some students eventually received no education at all. They were strictly there to work. The government believed that forced labor of students would make the schools more self-sustaining. Many of the students working in the schools in things like laundry and farming and that received injuries due to the equipment they were using, and the injuries were blamed on the students. It was their fault that they were injured. The injuries often went unreported to the government, and most of the time government only found out if a parent complained or if the government received a bill for hospital services because somebody had been taken in due to an injury. Students worked to produce revenue for the schools. One of the things that they did was the milk that was gathered from the cows, it was skimmed for the cream. Butter was made, the cream and butter were sold to whomever, the community. Students only received skimmed milk. And the residential schools were overcrowded, lacked proper ventilation, heating and lighting. Their homes also lacked adequate sanitation. There was limited access to clean water, as well as overcrowding. And the poor, overcrowded housing and schools buildings contributed to the TB health crisis. Okay, students complained they were always hungry. The food provided to them was very different than what they ate at home. At home they had moose, they had berries, they had bannock, things that they would hunt or harvest from the land. One survivor reported that at the school that she attended, they got watery soup, little diet in their meat, and the foods were unfamiliar and unpalatable. The food supply was inadequate to meet the needs of the students. There was a constant shortage of milk, and as I said before, cream and butter were sold off, and students just received skim milk. Traditional foods were rarely provided and usually were not prepared appropriately for the students in the ways that they were used to. Cooks were not familiar with how to cook the traditional foods for the students. Staff often ate better than the students. One student commented that they were stingy with their bread. And another thing that another student comment was that she liked to work in the kitchen because when the leftovers came in from what the staff hadn't eaten, then she would actually eat their leftovers because it was better food than what the students themselves were receiving. Inspectors confirmed that there was inadequacies in the food supply. They said it was plain and barely sufficient for the older students. And there was a report in 1947 that no school in the residential school system was doing a good job at feeding the children. Students did find ways to supplement their diet. Some of the boys would go out and hunt things like squirrels, gophers, skin them, cook them over a fire, help supplement their diet. They would share it with the girls. There were some kitchen staff that actually sold bread to the students because they were so hungry and they needed food, so they were actually able to make a little money with it. So the health crisis, the TB health crisis, peaked in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was set in motion by the separation of Aboriginal peoples from their lands, which disrupted their supply and their economies. There was a period of starvation where rations were withheld by the government to force Aboriginal people to abandon their lands that they had chosen for reserves. And when the aid did come, the food that they needed, it was very slow in coming to assist them. 50% of identified deaths were from tuberculosis. Deaths of Aboriginal students was far higher than it was for the general population, and it remained high until the 1950s when treatment was finally introduced. The second common cause of death was influenza. The third common was pneumonia, and the fourth was just general lung disease. TB flourished due to poor housing and sanitation issues. The poor conditions intensified the TB, and it was a prevalent cause of death. Children who were infected at home were still sent to the schools. Part of it was they had to, the funding was per student, so they were trying to keep their numbers up. So they may go there sick, and there was healthy students, and then those students became ill. Children were sent home only when they became too ill to be there, when they were a danger to others. And if they already had TB present in the home, they would send the sick children back to the home. The true number of student deaths are unknown, as record keeping was inconsistent, and most of the records related to these students' health have been destroyed. Their retention policy at that time was School records were destroyed after 5 years and accident reports after 10 years. And most of the correspondence related to medical treatments, appointments, advice for treatment, requests for treatments has been destroyed. And schools didn't always report the deaths to the government. Okay. So the calls to action. Following extensive interviews and investigation, the TRC identified 94 calls to action. Calls to action come from all areas of society. They address such areas as child welfare, education, language, culture, justice, Canadian government, settlement agreement parties, equity in the legal system, National Council for Reconciliation, professional development and training for public servants, church apologies and reconciliation, education for reconciliation, youth programs, museums and archives, missing children and burial info, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, commemoration, media and reconciliation, sports and reconciliation, business and reconciliation, and newcomers to Canada. Okay, so the calls to action related to health are numbers 18 to 24, and they're are related to health and identify the actions to be taken about for reconciliation for the Aboriginal peoples. So reconciliation is the ongoing process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships. A critical part of this process involves repairing damaged trust by making apologies, providing individual and collective reparations, and following through with concrete actions that demonstrate real societal change. The actions are all levels of government, involve all levels of government, federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments as well. Okay, so the calls to action, I'm just going to try and summarize them because they're lengthy. Related to health, calling upon federal, provincial, and territorial Aboriginal governments to acknowledge the current state of Aboriginal health in Canada as a direct result of Canadian government policies, including residential schools, and to recognize and implement the healthcare rights of Aboriginal people as identified in international law, constitutional law, and under the treaties. Number 19, we call upon the federal government in consultation with Aboriginal peoples to establish measurable goals to identify and close the gaps in health outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities, and to publish annual progress reports and assess long-term trends. Such efforts would focus on indicators such as infant mortality, maternal health, suicide, mental health, addictions, life expectancy, birth rates, infant and child health issues, chronic diseases, illness and injury incidents, and the availability of appropriate health services. Number 20, in order to address the jurisdictional disputes concerning Aboriginal people who do not reside on reserves, we call upon the federal government to recognize, respect, and address the distinct health needs of the Métis, Inuit, and off-reserve Aboriginal people. 21, we call upon the federal government to provide sustainable funding for existing and new Aboriginal healing centers to address the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual harms caused by residential schools, and to ensure that funding of healing centers in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories is a priority. I'm going to skip number 22 for a minute. 23, we call upon all levels of government to increase the number of Aboriginal professionals working in the healthcare field, ensure the retention of Aboriginal healthcare providers in Aboriginal communities, and provide culture competency training for all healthcare professionals. Number 24, we call upon medical, nursing, and nursing schools in Canada to require all students to take a course dealing with Aboriginal health issues, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous teachings and practices. We will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and racism. So that is the calls to action that are related to health. Now, number 22 We call upon those who can affect change within the Canadian healthcare system to recognize the value of Aboriginal healing practices and use them in treatment with Aboriginal patients in collaboration with Aboriginal healers and elders where requested by Aboriginal patients. So the question I put out there, or statement I want to say, is all nurses can affect change within the Canadian healthcare system. So the SRNA's commitment is to develop strategy to support work around the TRC calls to action and Indigenous health. Historically, the SRNA has provided awards in conjunction with the U of S for Aboriginal nursing students, as well as we have the Aboriginal Nursing Professional Practice Group. And information related to that group is on our website, so you could access that if you have any questions or just want to see what they're about. Okay, some of the recent activities that the SRNA has engaged in is recognition of the treaties and Aboriginal peoples. And as Terry did at the beginning, we acknowledge we're on Treaty 4 territory and all that that includes. We have engaged an elder through our council. She comes to our council meetings. She comes to our AGM. She does a prayer for us. She asks some very interesting questions for a layperson, and she's helping us to see the Aboriginal people's perspective. We have had a couple of blanket exercises at the SRNA. The last one was at the AGM. And people found it quite powerful. There were lots of tears after it, people taking the perspectives of other people, including those of the Aboriginal people, things like having their children taken away and that. So it is quite powerful. If you get the opportunity, you really should try and do one. And then we had a pipe ceremony here just last week prior to council, and that was a great success. We are focused on education related to TRC and the calls of action, so we're constantly working at and trying to find other ways to get the calls to action out there and to enaction them with our members. Okay. So now what? And how will you observe the calls to action? There are some different ways that you can do that, that you might want to think about just to increase your knowledge. You can make it part of your CCP. Do some reading. There's lots of information out there about TRC without having to read the great big report because it is quite lengthy. There is the the National Center
For Reconciliation.
Yes, sorry. The National Center for Reconciliation. It's at the University of Manitoba. And they have a lot of resources. They have stuff you can read online. If you wanted, you could actually order the TRC report from there. They have some videos. I've listened to some myself. They're actually people who, it's their testimony as to what happened to them in the residential school system. Very powerful stuff to listen to. Maybe you want to attend a blanket exercise or some other ceremony in your community. There's, you know, powwows, or I know sometimes with some of the smaller communities, they'll have health clinic days and they'll bring in speakers and, you know, people from the Aboriginal community. So take the opportunity. You don't have to spend lots of money. You just have to attend, go and see and listen to the Aboriginal peoples. They have a lot to say. At a staff meeting, you could maybe bring it up in a discussion. How are we as an organization or as a group of nurses observing the calls to action? How will we do this in our workplace? You know, it's something everybody could mull over and come back again with some ideas that maybe of ways how you can enact the calls to action. And the other thing is talk to an elder. They have so much knowledge. It's incredible. It's a fantastic conversation, and the elders want to share their knowledge. So if you know one, or if you meet one and you have a question, ask them, because they do want to share. that knowledge that they have. All right, and then any other questions that you have, you can always contact us at Practice Advice, and I'm open to questions right now if anybody has anything they want to ask.
So while we wait for some of those questions to come in, Carol, thanks very much for sharing, really bringing together and concisely talking about the truth. That's that first piece, and such an important piece of us understanding how and the importance of reconciliation is to better understand the truth of what happened and why we need to take this action. I was reminded of when Tim Malone was here a couple of years ago. He worked with the commission when they were doing their work, and he said they were tasked with providing recommendations, and they felt very strongly that the recommendations can be taken or left. You know, here's a recommendation, it's nice to have, but a call to action is really about action and taking that next step to make things better. And so that's why the report resulted with those calls to action. I think they are very powerful. So thanks for sharing, especially the health ones. As you said, every single one of us has the ability to make an impact in the health system. And really spending some time and making it a priority through your continuing competence program for the next year, I think is an excellent idea for, again, just spending that time, making that space in your life to learn more and do more about it. So great suggestions. Thank you. I don't see any questions right now, but we can wait a couple more minutes. Next week, we have a guest speaker Joanne Peterson is going to be speaking about PJ paralysis. She recently presented at a digital conference, and so she's sharing that, and there's going to be a message from a person who was who really helped create this movement from the UK, and so he's recorded a video that we'll share during that presentation. So I encourage you to join back in next week for our next webinar Wednesday. We took a little bit of a hiatus over the summer, but we're excited. We've got a jam-packed schedule now straight through to Christmas, so we're excited for that. Any last messages from Carol? I don't see any questions coming forward from the group.
I suggest even just read the executive summary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's very powerful. It makes you really stop and think. And I think, as Terry said, we can all impact this. And it doesn't matter what segment of society. I know we're nurses, this is sort of our wheelhouse, but there's lots of work to be done everywhere.
Perfect spot to end. Thank you very much, Carol. Have a great day, everyone.